Hey YouTube, how's it going? Kevin Clear here with a knife video. I want to talk just a little bit, I'll try not to be too long, but I will have some cool knives to show you, so I'll take the time to sort of feature the knives more so than my own thoughts. But I want to ask the question, does a knife need a ball bearing pivot system to be awesome? Okay, and I think you guys get what I'm driving at with that. Obviously, a knife doesn't need a ball bearing pivot system, right? There's no possible argument that says it has to have one. But what if we want the knife to just be that second kind of cool, that, all kinds of, we just want this to be in that upper crust of knives that have all the cool bells and whistles? Does it need a ball bearing pivot system to be in that category? Okay, and so that's where I want to go today. And I think this question is one that needs to be asked, because if you watch a lot of YouTube videos, and I try to keep up on what's being spoken, what's being talked about, what's being featured on some popular channels. And of course, a lot of the popular channels, especially those who are into higher end knives, will spend a lot of time talking about the action on the knife and the ball bearing pivot system. Okay, and sometimes it's a dual ball bearing pivot system. Okay, so I think it's legitimate to ask the question, did that $1,500 knife, did that $800 knife need that ball bearing pivot system? If it didn't have it, would you have been like, I don't even know why I bought this thing? And so that's the question that I really want to ask and sort of work through. Okay, now I just kind of hinted at it, but I want to point out that a lot of YouTubers, myself included, are guilty of kind of buying into this, ball bearing pivot system is cool sort of mentality. And so I'm sure if I go back in my own videos, and I can kind of remember doing this as I'm talking about a knife. This knife doesn't have one. This is the Eraser from CRKT. But, I'm going through the list of features and I go, hey, ball bearing pivot system, right? Like, as if that's like just the awesomest thing ever. And I have tried in recent times to kind of back away from doing that. By the way, check out the action on this knife without a ball bearing pivot, right? That's pretty impressive. So I'll bring this one back in a second when I get to that portion of the video. But number one, I think us as reviewers and as YouTubers and knife guys in the community, we kind of contribute to this whole trend by making a big point out of that particular feature. And the same thing's happened with the over travel stop. The lock bar stabilizer that comes on the XM18. You can look at a lot of reviews and they're going to make sure that they say, hey, this knife has a lock bar stabilizer. Check it out right here. Oftentimes all it is an over travel stop, not really a lock bar stabilizer. But anyway, it's sort of one of those things that we as YouTubers fall into. Okay, and so that's number one. When we list features, we seem to put ball bearing pivot system at the front of the list as if it makes something way better. Okay. The second thing I want to point out is that largely this is a trend. All right. I can remember back in the 90s, I guess late 90s, early 2000s, someone who knows for sure can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but if you guys remember back when the Mach 3 razor came out from Gillette, it had 3 blades, and they were like, these 3 blades just make this the most awesome thing that ever existed. And in fact, I remember buying one and using one and being rather impressed with the 3-blade shave. It was pretty comfortable, and it was good. But it became a trend, so that before long, like within a few years, maybe 1 or 2 years, every company came out with these numerous blades on their razors, to where they would have like 6 blades. I think Schick came out with a razor that had 6 blades, and you're like, come on. At some point, you have to realize, okay, extra blades do help the stability on the skin, and they help that one blade, they stop that one blade from having the ability to sort of dig in at a particular spot. They act as sort of a buffer. And so there's some value to that. But it became completely ridiculous, okay? It was just a trend. And in some ways, I think the ball bearing pivot system is like that, all right? And here's where I think this is kind of coming from. What's driving this trend? I've got a couple of blades here. This is the Boker Federal, and the action on this is beautiful. One of the things that I love this knife. One of the things I love about it is look how small the flipper is, and yet even with only that little bit of distance, like I can only push this maybe 1/4 of an inch, and look at that. Unlike something like this, where the flipper's huge, this is my Ferrum Forge Ferrix, like the flipper's gigantic, so I know I'm going to get a good deployment every time no matter what. You could probably dump, you know, maple syrup in here and it would still deploy really well because of the fact that that you have so much leverage on that flipper. Now, you guys know I love this knife. It is an absolute favorite in my collection. But my point is that now this does have a ball bearing pivot system. This one's just a little shorter. But here you go. So these two knives are kind of one of the things that indicate what's driving this trend. Custom knives and mid-tech knives where guys who are into those are looking for a level of engineering, a level of detail, a level of effort, okay, that's beyond the ordinary, okay? They don't want phosphor bronze bushings, not because they don't work, right? That's a beautifully smooth, super fast knife, and there's not even the slightest hint of blade play. Okay, so totally awesome. No ball bearings in this at all, but all they are is bushings. You know, all they are is a couple of washers. I feel like I could do that myself, right? So in custom knives, where some of these custom makers are actually making their own system for building in a ball bearing system. Now this is obviously not a custom, but it's standing for an actual GTC. In a custom knife, sure, ball bearing pivots are of course appropriate, but you got to keep in mind that generally custom knives, and by the way they should be, are more about form than they are about function. And one of the things I love about this knife is it has all the pride of ownership, all the quality, all the excellence of a mid-tech knife, but it is definitely a knife that's all about function. And so that's why it's such a favorite on my list. But in a knife that's more about form, okay, it becomes really important that some of those little things like a ball bearing pivot system are in there, okay? Now, could a custom maker build a knife that didn't have a ball bearing pivot? I think it would be really cool if they did. And I would go so far as to say it's actually almost more important. So let's go back to the Hinderer for a second. This thing is really, really smooth, okay? There's no ball bearings here at all. It's extremely smooth, and it's done not by putting ball bearings in here or anything else. It's done by a level of quality that is just off the charts, okay? And I would say the same thing about Savenzas and Striders and a number of other high-end production knives. They don't need a ball bearing pivot because the quality of workmanship is so high and those tolerances are so perfect that everything just moves nicely as it should. All right, so here's where I think there's this weird thing happening right now. Ball bearing pivot, does it add a level of coolness and quality? Not necessarily, but if you're buying a custom knife and it has a ball bearing pivot, it's cool to know that that maker had to cut those grooves into the frame. They had to figure out how the ball bearings were going to fit, where they were going to interface with the blade, how that was going to impact detent and all that kind of stuff. So from the standpoint of a custom collector, I can understand the interest in ball bearing pivot, okay? But while I understand it, I think we have to admit that it's more form than function, all right? And here's one more thing I want to add to this at this point. There is this idea that we need to think of that, in fact, a ball bearing pivot can allow you to cheat a little bit, especially now with the KVT and the IKBS ball bearings. They're caged ball bearings. They can be dropped into a knife just like a washer. I mean, there's no extra steps in manufacturing. There's no extra degree of difficulty. And so you have like $35, $40 knives like the Tirade and a number of others, the Hootenanny and whoever, a bunch of new CRKTs this year had ball bearing pivots. And they're, you're really, really hard pressed to argue that they're necessary or that they're really contributing a whole lot to the knife other than this one thing. They are doing this, guaranteeing a smooth action from a fairly tight pivot without having to have perfect tolerances, okay? So in this knife, pair 2, if something is not right in here, I'm never going to get this kind of action and not have blade play. If one little thing isn't square, if one little thing isn't perfectly flush, I'm going to get blade play. And the only way I'm going to take that blade play out is to smush everything a little bit. And when I do that, I'm not going to get that kind of smooth drop, okay? So, what I can do, if I don't want to go to this level of effort and quality, I can keep my same quality standards, add a ball bearing pivot, and I know that blade's going to be smooth as silk all the time. I never have to think a thing about it. Okay, so what I am suggesting that there's the potential for a little bit of cheating there. Okay, so now let's go finally to the point that really matters. Does a ball bearing pivot affect performance? All right, here's a Kershaw Skyline S30V carbon fiber Skyline. Check out the flipping on this. It is lightning fast. I can go ahead and cut whatever I want to cut, put the knife away, and I'm done. Whether or not this has a ball bearing pivot system, which it doesn't, makes very little or no difference, okay? It doesn't really affect performance at all. And I've got a few examples I want to show you. So there's the Skyline, very fast, very smooth deployment. Zero tolerance, 0-200. Now I failed on that one. Zero tolerance, 0-200, very smooth, very fast deployment. Okay, and because of the weight of this blade, if I even give a hint of wrist action, it goes from just smooth and fast to lightning fast with just the slightest movement of my wrist. Okay, so there's another good example. No pivot here at all. Let's see. Eraser from Liang Ma, CRKT designed by Liang Ma. Super fast, super smooth, in fact amazingly smooth, best action, one of the best actions of any knife I've seen, and no ball bearing pivot. Okay, so again, I think you guys are starting to get my point. Para 2, now by the way, there is some variation in Para 2s, okay? I've had 4, all of them were free droppers that I had, but they were different, okay? All of them would drop pretty freely, but not all of them were as smooth. This is one of the smoother ones that I had. This is the S35VN sprint run. Pretty much my favorite sprint run on this knife. But now, and that's the point. That goes back to the point I made earlier, where you can get some variation. Most Para 2s though are pretty smooth, or they can get that way with a little bit of breaking in. All right. So, does it affect performance in terms of action? Not overly. However, it can affect performance. Let me show you this knife. When I got this knife, it did not flip well at all. In fact, you could not deploy it like this. You needed a lot, and I mean a lot of wrist action to get this knife to deploy. Why? Because there was so much dirt and crap and gunk inside the pivot that the ball bearings could not roll freely. And ball bearings lend themselves to creating a bunch of space in and around the pivot so that stuff can get in there, okay? And guess what? Over time, that stuff's going to develop in there again. I can tell you right now that when I sprayed WD-40 in here to clean this out, the WD-40 ran out the bottom black, okay? So it was filthy. It was filled with dirt and grime and all that kind of crap. And by the way, anything made in China, if you buy a gun made in China, if you buy, a lot of times the factories are really dirty. And so cleaning stuff up like that is probably advisable. But this knife perfectly illustrates the point that I'm making here, that a bunch of dirt and grime and junk in there is really going to cause you problems, all right? Now, does that, is a non-ball bearing, is a washer or phosphor bronze bushing system 100% better all the time? Not necessarily. They can get dirty too, they can get gummed up too, but not to the same extent and not as readily, because there's no space, there's no place for dirt and crap to get in there. So this knife, yeah, I adjusted the pivot to the way I wanted it and I oiled it so that it works. That was about a year ago, okay? And I haven't done anything with it since, and it still comes out so smooth and so nice. And between now and then, I've carried it a bunch of times, but a lot of the time it's been sitting in my display rack, just not doing too much, and the oil has stayed where I put it, and everything is good to go. All right, so does it affect performance? Very little, okay? And I will say this, most of these knives that I've shown you that have very smooth actions, a little bit of time, a little bit of TLC went into getting it that way. When I first got this knife, it would flip, but there was blade play, and of course I cannot tolerate that, so I had to adjust it and oil it until I got it to where zero blade play, plus it still flips open well, okay? And that's just part of the game for me. That's part of what I like, is tinkering with these knives a little bit. Would that have happened if there was a ball bearing pivot system? Probably not, right? Sometimes it's a little smoother. So, in conclusion, let me say that a ball bearing pivot system, there's nothing inherently wrong with it other than that weak point that I've just been talking about, but that's get overable, right? If you got a can of WD-40 around, you can clean out those pivots pretty easily and re-oil it after that. Remember, WD-40 is not a lubricant, okay? But you can clean it and you get it back up to proper working order without too much effort. So it's really one of those things where it's not, it's an extra feature that doesn't do a whole lot, because this doesn't have a ball bearing pivot, flips open great. This does have a ball bearing pivot, and guess what? It flips open great, right? Is it a little faster? Yeah, but I think that has a lot to do with the detent on this knife. These two knives would maybe make a better example. These are obviously the two more expensive ones that I've got here. Here's the Hinderer, flips open. Here's the Ferrum Forge, flips open. Both of them flip open well. The Ferrum Forge flips better, but that's largely a function of detent. Whatever impact it has on performance is almost negligible. All right. So when you're looking at a knife and you're going to buy it, if it's got a ball bearing pivot and you really like that, great. If it doesn't have a ball bearing pivot though, and you really like the knife, don't let that be something that dissuades you, because ultimately it doesn't mean a whole lot. It's really, more than anything else, just a trend that maybe adds a little bit of cool factor, and it's really for those people who are more into form than they are into function. All right, there you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd love to hear your comments. Maybe there's somebody who just believes wholeheartedly that every knife should have a ball bearing pivot, and you really can't wait to disagree with me. I'd love to hear your reasoning behind that. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed the video and have a great day.